man, my equal, my companion, and my acquaintance, when we took sweet counsel together and walked to the house of God in the throng. Let death seize them, let them go down alive into hell, for wickedness is in their dwellings and among them. And you can say to Jane, David knows what it's like to walk arm in arm with somebody down the aisle in the house of God, only to have him turn against you and betray you. David knows what it's like, and he went to the Lord and said that. You are not alone in this, Jane. And that can be the beginning of Jane's emotional healing, when she begins to say, God does know what I'm going through, because he's heard this from David and from others. Okay? And then the whole dysfunctional behavior. Now we come to the dysfunctional behavior part, and this is where we can gently begin. After all of this, see, this is what I'm saying. Now we can talk about confession and absolution. This is where we begin to say to Jane, okay, Jane, now after all of this, we've talked about the wounds, we've talked about all these things, we've talked about who you are in Christ Jesus, we've talked about Jesus loves you, we've talked about this emotions. Now let's talk about these behaviors that you really need to do something about. How would you really confess those? And we'll deal with terms of confession, so that you might receive forgiveness for specific dysfunctional behaviors. Once you've gently brought her along to that point where she knows, yeah, there are some things that I really screwed up, haven't I, Pastor? Yes, but there is forgiveness right there for you. That's where the forgiveness is. In the places where she knows she has contributed, I don't want to say contributed, but she's done these things because they're inappropriate coping mechanisms, but because she's been a victim. So you're not victimizing her any further, but you're saying, Jane, there are some things that you really need to have additional gospel poured out in a totally different way. And now we can come to her life situation and say, okay, pastoral care, updates, maybe structured sanctification, like a 12-step program, like I said before earlier, coaching. I really think something like AA or Celebrate Recovery, some kind of program like that, if we can look on it as a structured sanctification and say, there are some people who have really mastered the art of saying there are certain things that need to happen in a healing environment that will help you to heal and help you to move on and help you to consider, to continue to do better. And that will help Jane. Much more than to just go waltzing in there and say, okay, Jane, what are you doing? Let's get you to confessing. But I think to bring the whole idea of confession and absolution to Jane in terms of the context of this total care package, and bring it in an appropriate moment, an appropriate time, and help her out in that way. There's a paragraph there on other kinds of how we deal with people, how we help them in terms of trauma-informed care, how we keep them safe, how we love them, how we encourage them, and so forth. So there's a lot of stuff there. There's another handout that I added to this that is just one sheet that has for further reading, just so that you don't go away totally empty-handed, which I know you won't. But there is a lot of good stuff out there, a lot of good work being done to help individuals who are really struggling and hurting with this whole area. So there we are. Now we are I think we're at the end of the tour. Some applications of the confession absolution paradigm, and I think it turned out to be an exercise in casuistry in some respects, but also to say we can talk about confession and absolution, but let's also tread carefully in terms of where and when we want to do it. There are some places where it might not be entirely appropriate. There are other places where it would be, if we use it in a healing manner, it would be very healing. So we have to be careful when and where we're going to do it. Okay, so I guess that takes care of it for now. Go ahead, George.
Okay, from the parking lot here, when you were talking about the abuser and what he needs is total version. Am I hearing you say that perhaps the start of that is with the shock of having first told the abused, get out of the situation, get to a place of safety?
Yep. I think that's a good place to start. You know, that's a real difficult, let me talk about that for a little bit. People who work in this area will say it's real difficult for women to get to do that, and it'll often take them between 5 and 7 tries before they actually will leave. A lot of it has to do with the other surrounding areas. Some of it is, you know, I don't want to get beaten up, but if I leave, where am I going to go? I'm not going to have a place to stay. I'm not going to have a roof over my head. I'm not going to be able to feed my family, etc. So they, they really have to work up an immense amount of courage to leave that situation. But for the most part, the place to start with the abuser is the shock of saying she actually left, and she's actually gone for good. And that book of Why Does He Do That? The book says, for the most part, that guy's experience has been the guy, the abuser, only wakes up when he gets incarcerated. It's the only thing that'll do it. I don't know. You know, if you read the literature, it sounds like the only thing that will do it is if somebody breaks the cycle and says, you don't get to be in control of this relationship. And maybe short of incarceration, the option is divorce. Okay. Now, I know that that's something that pastors don't like to say, but I've said that to other pastors when they come to me and they say, what do we think I ought to do? I said, you're not going to like hearing this, but I think you ought to keep it in your mind that you should tell this woman, maybe you should divorce your husband. Break the relationship. Just end it. And tell him, this is how you're not going to be in control of my life or relationship. We're done.
Could it be said that in that situation, the relationship has effectively been broken by the person leaving her through the abuse?
Sure, you could say it that way. You could say it that way if it makes you feel better.
Yeah.
But I think it would be better to say, this is not a godly relationship because he's already made himself the God in your relationship. And is that the kind of, that's not a godly relationship, that's an idolatrous relationship. Okay, go ahead, Tom.
Another approach might be, well, let me explain it from a circumstance in Yonkers, New York. I had a parishioner, 2 good Lutherans, went to church every Sunday, but he was a wife beater. And she complained about it to me, and I said, the next time he abuses you physically, you call me.
Mm-hmm.
So she did. I went down there. I said, in her presence, at his presence, call the police. And previously I told her, I believe this is way back in history, previously I told her, next time he beats you up, you're going to call the police and you're going to file charges against him. And then he will be arrested and he will be in jail. And then the court psychiatrist will take over on him. And if he needs to be hospitalized, he will. Well, that's what happened. She called up, I went down to the house, and she just lived down the street. And the police came, she filed charges, he was jailed, he went for therapy for 3 months in a mental hospital. He had a mental problem. Well, that's, who knows, you know. But anyway, he was in a hospital 3 months. When he came out, I was amazed. He was a totally different person. By the way, they had triplets afterwards. And I would see him walking down the street with this 3 carriages, arm in arm with his wife. Never beat her up again.
All right, I'm going to say, let me comment on a couple of things on that. First of all, You know, that he had a mental problem is telling, but it may be exceptional. Okay, just from reading the literature and hearing what people are, you know, what the people who are working in the field are telling us, that he had a mental problem is telling, but it's exceptional, because that he had a mental problem and was able to receive healing in a mental institution and then go on from there and they were able to be okay, is indicative. Okay, and exceptional, and it certainly was a good thing. But as I said before, the majority, and perhaps the vast majority of people who are abusers are not abusers because they have a mental problem. It's because they have a values problem. And their values are, I get to be in charge of this relationship. It has nothing to do with mental illness. It has everything to do with their value system. Okay, and that's why you cannot deal with them until you break that value system. The other thing that will happen is that a lot of people will tell you these days too is you got to be careful. There's a lot of ins and outs in telling somebody, when he beats you, call the police. Okay, because if you don't, you have to talk. You're almost, pastors these days, I want to say, you almost want to talk to your police department first and say, what would you do if you got called to this scene? Because there are some police departments who will go and they investigate incident based. Okay, like they'll say, did he hit her? Did she hit her? I don't know. It's his word against hers, her word against his. What are we supposed to do? They walk out the door. As soon as they turn the corner, he's more vicious to her than ever before. Okay, so you want to find out from the police department, how are they going to investigate a domestic violence call? Or are they going to do it course of conduct based? Are they going to look around and say, you know, this house looks crummy, the dogs are chained up outside, you know, it looks like there's a whole mountain of evidence here that says this is what happened. You might want to find out from the court. How is the court going to deal with it when it goes to the court? Because there are courts, apparently, who are saying, we are taking these charges not as violence charges, but as a whole galaxy of things, and saying, this is how we're going to deal with it, and we are going to lock you up in a jail for this X period of time, because this is a domestic violence issue, and so forth. There are some police departments where, when they go on a domestic violence call, the police officers will find they'll send a detective and a social worker or somebody from the prosecutor's office to that call right then and there, so that they both will have enough eyeball evidence so that they will press charges right there. That's what some of them are doing these days, and it's becoming more and more widespread. So it might be a good idea to find out before you advise somebody to make that call. And the other thing to say is, you know, there are tons of reasons why victimized women do not want to call the police. You know, because, you know, as I said, you know, you haul him off to jail, and what am I going to do for money? If he's got control of all the money, what am I going to do to buy groceries? What am I going to do to to pay the bills? What am I going to do for this or that? So, you know, that advice, while good in Yonkers at that time, may not always be the best advice. And it turned out well because he had a mental problem. But it might not always be the best advice. There's a lot of other considerations. And I would say, before you tell somebody that, check out with your local police department what the course of action is likely to be if they get it, if you recommend that to somebody. John.
My experience in our city is that the police deal with recidivists all over the place, because what happens is someone gets charged with domestic violence, they incarcerate him, they might suggest treatment, but I'm not so sure. The police are just dealing with the assault and the physical stuff, and they haul them in to get them separated.
Yeah.
And they might then place them in jail, but I'm not so sure that treatment is always offered the abuser. Now, I would hope that the social workers who are dealing with that, social advocates in the court, are helping them be abused, to find a place of safety. But what happens is, the same people are coming back to court.
Yeah,
It's happening,
Yeah.
so I think more often than not, you're right. She can't leave him, and he won't let her leave him. He's going back to what he can do, and I'm not so sure they really address the core issues.
Now,
And
are
I'm
you
not
in-
so sure that municipal courts are set up to deal with that either.
are you in Summit County or in Stark County?
Stark.
Stark County.
And they're a very compassionate municipal court, because with drugs and that kind of stuff, alcohol,
Yeah.
they do deal with rehab, but I'm not so sure with domestic violence that they do.
See, and I don't know where this all falls out. It might also depend on what docket it all falls into. I mean, in Medina County, I'm not sure whether those kind of calls go into municipal court or whether they go to domestic relations. And right now, our domestic relations court, at least according to the person who's running for a new judge, thinks the domestic relations court is in a mess. That the docket is totally messed up. So I don't really know where a domestic violence call goes in Medina County. So my advice to, if I find that there's a woman who is in that situation, my first advice is to them to say, have you talked to somebody at the Battered Women's Shelter? Because they generally have a much better grip on what the processes are likely to be than I do in any particular municipality in Medina County, Georgia.
So, when you're talking about the woman is abused, she's trapped in that cycle of abuse because she's afraid she's not gonna have a roof over her head, she's not gonna have food for herself.
Yeah.
What I'm hearing you say then is make sure that there is a plan for her to go someplace where she and the kids can be provided for before the call is made to the police.
Absolutely, and that's what some advocates will do, is they'll say, do you have an escape plan? Do you have a go bag for yourself and for the kids? Is it off-site? So can you, if you have an escape plan with a go bag with some cash or a thing, is it at a friend's house, is it a neighbor's house, at a relative's house? Where you can just say to the kids, come here, we're gonna go for a ride, and you can go right there, get that, pick it up, and off you go to the shelter. And shelter advocates will tell you that's probably the best thing to do. And don't let him even know that you've even got such a thing. And sometimes that's a good first step, but sometimes it takes the women a lot of nerve to get up even that first step. Because that means that they have to admit to themselves that they really need to do that. John?
Aren't there a lot of abused people, and whether they're males who are abused, we don't want to forget the
Right.
males who are abused by women verbally and mentally and even physically.
Right.
And the other way around, how, I forgot my question, but how are we going to be advocates for them and help them to get over the wounds? And if so many abused people have to get over the fact that they probably were abused as children too. They seek those kind of relationships. They need to get over that kind of a mindset too.
Right.
Because they'll end one abusive relationship and they go right to another. There's a gal I know in our area, she's been involved about 5 or 6, she's been a baby mom for about 3 different guys.
Yeah.
And she keeps going towards the same abusive kind of men. And I think
I
our
understand
failure is not knowing how to handle that and stop the trauma.
I understand that, and I think there's two ways we can, I think there's 2 ways we can do that. I think there are people in the community that are much more skilled and trained in dealing with those specific issues than I am. If I had somebody like that, I would really want to call my friend Amber and say, what did you do? What were your resources, from the rape crisis? How can I direct this person appropriately to help with those specific kinds of issues that I just don't have access to? But the other side of that coin would be to say, and I've tried to do this too, there's a resource that isn't on that list because it's not really domestic violence, but it's a Henry Nouwen book called The Return of the Prodigal Son. And Henry Nouwen looks at the story of the prodigal son in a Rembrandt picture, The Return of the Prodigal Son. And he says there's one point where you look at the picture, and Nouwen became convinced. Somebody told him, that at a certain point in his life, Nouwen was called to become the welcoming father. And just to say, whether it's the son who left or the son who stayed, it's the father's job to welcome either of them home into his open arms without asking any questions, just to say, you are my child, you've always been my child, this home has always been your home, I will always love you, I will not ask any questions, this is where you belong, welcome home. And I think that is the kind of pastor I would like to be for that kind of person. And when we have that kind of person, that's what I try to do. I try, until they're ready to say, Pastor, I think I screwed up, then I'm ready to say, okay, now we can talk about that in terms of confession and absolution. But until then, I'm ready to say, you belong here, this is a place where we love you, I will always love you, I will not question anything you did, you have no judgment on my part, you are welcome here. You are a child of God who belongs in this place, and we will love you as much as we possibly can until you realize that you have worth and value in our eyes as much as we do in God's eyes. And you don't have to look for that in the arms of somebody else. Yeah.
Jose, Tom, and then why don't we take a 10-minute break?
Yeah.
Where does the wife get the feeling or the thinking that she's at fault, which means that any effort to try to get her out of the relationship, she's going to fight. Is it the fault of the parent, the wife's parent, or family? Where does it start? That horrible feeling that you are not worth anything, so that this person, takes advantage of all of that.
Yeah, it can come from a number of places.
Okay.
It can come from a number of places, and it just depends on the individual. Sometimes it does come from messages she heard when she was little. It just really depends. If she was the daughter when her father wanted a boy, he's going to be saying, I never wanted a girl. I always wanted a boy. And she's going to be hearing, well, Dad never wanted. She's going to have this feeling of worthlessness, or whatever it might be. The other part of that, so whatever messages she's been hearing, maybe it's been her whole life, maybe she just got involved in this guy. The other issue with her is there's going to be a somewhat of an entrapment idea and an inability to escape. We have this, I don't know what the name of the experiment is called, but there's an experiment where they've done this with dogs. And we think that the same thing happens with people. We're pretty sure it happens with people. Although we don't want to compare them, people with dogs really. But what they do with dogs is they put them in a cage and they lock the cage. And then they electrify the floor of the cage so they can send a shock into the floor of the cage. So periodically they'll shock the cage. And when the dog is first in there and they shock the cage, the dog will hurl itself against the door of the cage, trying to escape, because the dog knows that's how it came in, that's how it will get out. But because the door of the cage is locked, when the shock happens, the door won't open. And the dog will hurtle itself against the door of the cage repeatedly until it learns that it can't get out. And then eventually, the dog just gives up. And as long as the cage door is locked and shut, it knows it just can't get out. So the shocks keep coming, and the dog just curls up in a ball in a corner of the cage, even though the shocks keep coming. And then what the experimenters do is they unlock the door and even open it. But the dog has learned it can never escape the shocks. So even though the door is open, the dog stays in the cage. And we think that that kind of thing happens with human beings when they're imprisoned in that kind of relationship. They're so beaten down by, wherever it came from. Childhood, teenage years, bullying of one sort or another, that even when there's a way of escape that's open to them, they don't know how to get out.
Tom?
Thank you, Chris, for your paper, it's terrific.
Great.
Thank you.
And just one thought that came in my mind, getting back to the abuser, is there any, narcissism?
Narcissism?
Yeah, narcissism? Is
Play.
there any value in that kind of thing in this guy's behavior?
I don't know what you mean by value of it. I mean, narcissism is narcissistic behavior would be sort of a psychological term.
Yeah.
If you wanted to use that, I mean, you could say that. If you wanted to do a psychological diagnosis and call it malignant narcissism, I suppose you could do that.
No, my question is,
You
how
gotta renege that.
prevalent do you think it might be that the abuser is guilty of that? Then that puts it in a different dimension of, it becomes a more complex issue then for the guy.
Well, yeah, it becomes a more complex issue, but I think I think there were, I want you to understand this. There are when you talk about things like malignant narcissism or sociopathic behavior or something like that, you're still talking in the realms of a psychological / medical type diagnosis. Okay, this is some kind of mental illness for which there might be a course of treatment that would involve mental hospital medication, that kind of stuff, because that's usually how we try to treat mental illnesses. So when we begin to think in terms of, those kind of personality disorders or extreme social disorders, we're thinking in terms of mental illness. There are those in the field of, like particularly this Why Does He Do That, and a number of other people in the field who deal with this thing, who say, this is not a mental illness, it's a matter of you have somebody who's playing an entirely different game. It's like we're all playing baseball and they're playing football, and they refuse to play the same game we're playing. It's not a mental illness. It's nothing like that. It's they're playing a totally different game than we're playing, and they will not play by our rules. And so to try and hospitalize them, to try and medicate them is not going to work, because they're not playing by the same rules. It's a different belief system, it's a different value system. It's that kind of thing. It's like trying to get, it's like trying to, I don't know what it's like.
I got you.
It's like, you
I
get
got
me?
you.